welcome to the Northwest Author Series by the Cannon Beach Library. Today we have Lori Tobias, who has written a book called Storm Beat. And here we have it, and it looks like it's backwards on my screen, but maybe not. So I will introduce Lori, and then she will take it away for a good hour of conversation. Lori Tobias arrived on the Oregon coast in 2000. After freelancing from Newport for several years, she signed on to the Oregonian as a stringer covering the coast from Florence to Astoria. Later, she was hired as a staff writer responsible for the entire coast, one person for 363 miles. The job meant long hours, covering stories ranging from capsized fishing boats, murders, dangerous storms, and debris washed up from the tsunami in Japan. Tobias has worked as a journalist for more than 25 years, including time at the Rocky Mountain News in Colorado as a columnist and features writer. She currently freelances for several publications and is a columnist for Oregon Arts Watch. Her novel, Wander, was published by Red Hen Press in 2016. Tobias lives on the Oregon coast with her husband, Chan, and rescue pups, Luna and Monkey. Please help me welcome Lori Tobias. Hello, Lori.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. It's good to be here.
Well, welcome, and tell us about your book.
Okay, well,
experiences covering the coast.
Storm Beat is the behind-the-scenes stories of the stories I covered for the Oregonian. And so when I put the stories together, I tried to only include stories in which there was information that hadn't been in the newspaper, and preferably information that nobody else would have known, either about the story or about my life. Sometimes it was a situation where, sort of the behind the scenes, I'd get a phone call, and it just wasn't something you could include in the newspaper. Sometimes it is what's going on in my life. For example, I was covering, a story when my father was on his deathbed. I was on the beach in Agate, here in Newport on Agate Beach, covering the dock that floated in from Japan in the tsunami. And I learned my mother was in hospice. And actually, by the time I got home, my mother had died. So there's a lot of those little behind the scene things that obviously you wouldn't share in a news story, but I wanted to, when I put this book together, maybe to shine a little light on what a journalist does and goes through in the course of a day.
Yeah, it's an experience. I know, having worked also at the Oregonian for a while and for 15 years actually, and as a correspondent for 6 years or 7 years after that. It's quite an adventure, being a writer and being a freelancer and trying to do your own thing. So tell us more about your life and your experiences.
Well, I grew up in Pennsylvania, lived in the same house for 18 years. House where my father, 3 doors down from where my father was born and raised, and in a town where everybody pretty much stays where they were born and raised. People really don't leave, or if they do, they come back. Left at 18 to go see my sister in Alaska. So I fell in love with the place. I fell in love with Anchorage in Alaska, and ended up going to school there to study journalism. Got married in a little in a A-frame church with a view of Denali. And in the end, ended up living in a log cabin on the Kenai, which, 630 square foot and on 1.25 acres. And at first I absolutely hated it and grew to love it, to just love it. But it was the 80s and we hit the recession, and, there was just no work. And so my husband was a power lineman and he was an apprentice. And basically they said, they call it tramping. And so they said he could go. The apprenticeship school said, where do you want to go to work? And they saw that I was from back east. So they sent him to, of all places, Hackensack, New Jersey.
Oh, gee.
And he said, I can't bring my wife here. And so they dug a little deeper and they said, well, we can send you right near her parents, which of course is not where I wanted to go. I'd spent 18 years there. And so, but that's where I ended up,
Wow.
about 40 minutes from where raised. So I didn't stick around long enough for him to get his journeyman's card, and that was pretty much it. Yeah.
And then you've been elsewhere on the East Coast too. Did I read Connecticut?
I was in Connecticut, and I was the Capitol Bureau Chief for a small Eastern Connecticut newspaper. And actually really liked New England, the proximity to everything. You know, you could, in a matter of an hour and a half, you could be in Boston, you could be in New York, you could go to Rhode Island, you could go to the Cape. So that was enjoyable. But I just had this idea that I had to get back out to the Pacific Northwest, if not Alaska, which I realized was a little too remote, too expensive, too, hard to go, come and go. So we settled on, we thought the Seattle area. And I was in Seattle for about 9 months, and my husband had a job offer in Southern Oregon, and we took it and ended up there for Southern Oregon. It opened the world to me as far as beaches, the coast. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really care for Southern Oregon itself. So we left and went to Denver, and I was at the Rocky Mountain News for 3 or 4 years. And then we saw that there was a job offer on the Oregon coast, and here we are.
In Colorado on the Rocky Mountain News was completely different than your experience covering the news on the Oregon coast. So tell us a little bit about what you did on the Rocky Mountain News.
I wrote about very wealthy people's very ostentatious homes, homes with bowling alleys in the basement, homes with outdoor pools, heated surrounds under the ski lifts in Vail, just gorgeous, huge homes. Some of them were McMansions. Some of them were just, sort of big for the sake of being big. Some of them were just gorgeous. And some of them were lovely in that they were old. And so one house that stands out in my mind is it was older and it was big, but it had this huge sort of open kitchen, and it had a fireplace in the kitchen and sort of a sofa. This was the kitchen, and this sofa by the fireplace, and the fireplace opened up into the dining room. And it just, these big old hardwood floors. And it just struck me as I had never seen anything like that. I didn't know that you could have a kitchen with a sofa and a fireplace.
Well, sure. Sounds good.
It was pretty wonderful. And I covered a condo or an apartment in what they call Lodo, lower downtown. And the man who built it for his wife owned his own airlines. And they let me in, and with the agreement that I could write about only the public spaces. They wouldn't let me into like their bedroom or anything like that, but they had a rooftop swimming pool, and they had the downstairs opening was an art gallery. But what I really remember is at night, sitting in this, it was almost like having their own cocktail lounge, and looking out and seeing the city lights, and everything else was dark. And it was just the epitome of living large. But they weren't ostentatious. They had very good taste. She was actually very devout, and they did not want to blow their own horn or anything, but we bugged them to death because it was such a grand place. And so they let me in to write about it. It kind of ruins you, because after you've seen something like that, it's kind of like, yeah, okay, here I am in my little 2-story with standard appliances.
Tell us about what you covered at for the Oregonian on the coast. Give us a flavor of the book.
Sadly enough, so the Oregon coast is gorgeous. Nobody's going to doubt that. It's rugged, it's beautiful. I think it's pretty one of a kind. But, because of its terrain and location and setting, the elements, Mother Nature, it's actually can be a very deadly place if you don't pay attention. I guess it's difficult to navigate if you don't know what you're doing, if you go to places you're not supposed to go. So people come to unfortunate endings because they don't pay attention to their surroundings, or they don't pay attention to the signs, or they end up in a place they just shouldn't be, and they can't really get themselves out of it. And so one of the things it really illustrates is the Coast Guard does an amazing job here. And I don't know what we'd do without them. I really don't. So, but I was going to say, if you'd like, I can read a piece from the book.
That would be great. Yeah, please do.
This is a part from the prologue, and not too long. I had come to the coast by way of Pennsylvania, Alaska, Connecticut, Seattle, Southern Oregon, and finally Colorado, where I had a Sunday column and wrote features for the Rocky Mountain News. My husband, Chan, was a power lineman, and so we followed the big construction line jobs. Tramping, they call it. People felt bad for me moving all the time. I thought I was lucky. Every new town was a fresh adventure, even the grocery store. I wasn't sure I would ever stay in one place, but if we did settle down, we always said it would be on the Oregon coast. That was our mantra. In 2000, just as the Rocky Mountain News entered into a joint operating agreement, JOA, with the Denver Post that cast the Rocky as the loser, just as I hit a milestone year, just as the 1-year anniversary of the Columbine High School massacre came and went, I saw a help wanted ad for a lineman at a Central Coast utility and fired off my husband's resume. That was on a Monday. 1 week later, he interviewed with the Central Lincoln People's Utility District, the PUD, by phone. We flew to Portland Thursday and drove to the coast, where I wrote my Sunday column for the Rocky from a 3rd-story hotel room overlooking the beach. It was foggy and gray, and I thought it was beautiful and romantic and somehow a bit poignant. That night, we slept with the hotel room deck door open, electric cadet heater blazing, so we could better hear the surf. I knew there was a good chance we would move here, and the idea both thrilled and saddened me. In Denver, I was invited to restaurant openings, box seats at pro sport games, elite private parties, and social events. I was not the small town Pennsylvania daughter of a truck driver and waitress, neither of whom had graduated from high school. I was Lori Tobias with the Rocky Mountain News, 1st and 2nd place winner that year for features and magazine writing from the Colorado Society of Journalists. Who would I be on the Oregon coast? I knew that answer all too well. I would be another struggling writer with the dream of publishing my novel, a dream with a slim, slim chance of coming true. On staff at a newspaper or magazine, my work would be published and read. On my own, there were no such guarantees. They offered Chan the job that afternoon. The Oregon coast. It was supposed to be our version of paradise. We bought a house with views of the ocean set against a backdrop of towering evergreens and a profusion of flowers that bloomed wild nearly year-round. A place where traffic jams were 2 rounds at the same red light and violent crime the exception. And I was miserable. I loved the beauty of the Oregon coast, but I couldn't quite get my head around the idea that this was the end of the road. And I missed the Denver newsroom, missed the parties, the openings, the sun and the snow, even the pro sports games. And I missed my friends. I moved from a city where the phone book filled 2 volumes, each as thick as a brick, to one where you could fit the entire directory in a space as slender as a reporter's pad. Voicemail was not an option, and a phone call 20 miles away was long distance. For shopping, there was Fred Meyer, Walmart, and for a time, a small J.C. Penney's housed in a dull gray block of a building adjoining an auto parts store. Alone at my desk, facing the blank screen that was to be my novel, I found myself longing for a column like I'd had at the Rocky, this one to be centered on the Oregon coast. I wrote the editor at the Oregonian to plead my case. I told him how the coast was growing. I suggested stories that I, living in the heart of the coast, Yaquina Bay on one side of town, the Pacific on the other, was uniquely positioned to write. But the newspaper was cutting positions, not adding. And while I still held out hope in a Pollyannish sort of way that the news business would rebound, the grim decline had been the story of my career, and it was getting harder and harder to foresee a bright future in the world of paper and ink. So I eked out a living freelancing, something I've done most of my career. I landed a gig stringing for the New York Times. My first story was about Christian Longo, who murdered his wife and 3 children and threw their bodies in the Yaquina and Elsey Bays. It was only after I filed the story that I learned I would receive no byline. Weeks later, they sent in a correspondent for a more extensive story. He called with instructions on what I was to gather for him. When I balked, he noted that I would be paid for my time, of course. It did not escape my attention that overnight I had gone from being a columnist and features writer at one of the largest metro papers in the country to Girl Friday. Mostly I wrote magazine features and travel stories. I flew to Switzerland, Australia, Alaska, the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey, as I recalled it from my early years as a general assignment reporter and then Capitol Bureau Chief for a small Eastern Connecticut daily, meant long hours in mind-numbing meetings, daily monitoring of police reports, long drawn-out courthouse hearings, and covering topics of which I had little interest or worse knowledge. It also meant working long hours for which there would be no overtime pay, a pattern that I saw repeatedly in the business. I got the job offer on St. Patrick's Day, My first story would be about a model shipbuilder in North Bend, about 60 miles south of the area we had agreed I'd cover. It was an apt beginning. In short time, I'd be covering all 360 miles of the Oregon coast. Despite my early misgivings, I came quickly to believe that I had been blessed with the best writing gig on earth, albeit a dark one. I was always racing somewhere, and it was rarely for anything good. Often it involved death, car crashes, falls, murders, suicide, murder and suicides, drownings, capsizings. I don't think I'll ever be able to look out over that winter ocean, see the city of lights that is the crab fleet, and not worry, not feel that squeeze in my gut and wonder, not if, but when. Working on the Oregon coast made me a better writer and a better person, but it also made me wary, tentative, watchful. I don't run on the beach without knowing the tide. I don't ever step beyond the signs that warn not to. I don't even get close. And the sound of a sharp bang is never just a backfire, but a potential murder, suicide, or both. I'm sure I've always had some of that wariness in me, but covering the Oregon coast amplified it many times over. Nonetheless, if many of the mileposts along Highway 101 are defined for me by someone else's tragedy, so too are they reminders that I am blessed with having the privilege of working in the most amazing setting, a place where life is authentic and a landscape so stunningly beautiful, all these years later, it can still take my breath away. Thank you.
I can relate to a lot of that. I had a question just as a kind of a fellow reporter covering murder and mayhem and various tragedies. Reporters don't usually have the opportunity to talk to a counselor after they've covered a traumatic story, or go to a therapist, or have a psychological breakdown because they're off running to cover another story. So how, when you were covering capsized boats and murders and suicides, what did you do to kind of calm down or clear your head or debrief? Did you have any kind of routine that you went through, or any way of kind of clearing that off and getting ready for the next tragedy?
At the time, this is a hard one to explain, but at the time it's happening, you're aware that something devastating is happening, but you're also aware that you have a deadline, and sometimes you're in charge of your own photos. You have interviews, you have to interview people. So when you're on the scene, at least, you're so caught up in everything you have to do that kind of creates a filter. Again, it's there how terrible is, but you can't just sit there and cry about it. You can't even take a moment, because it's usually run, especially if it's just breaking. But what would happen is, after the fact, when your editor calls and says, okay, we're good, it's done, we're posting it, or going to print, or whatever back in the day, usually then it would kind of hit me. But I didn't really realize until hindsight just how heavy those stories were, and how heavy the routine of it. It just happened all the time. And I don't know if it was just that I was on top of things, if things had calmed down. I honestly don't know. But I've had people read the book and kind of say, how did you manage that? Or how did you function through that? Or I worry about you, or I feel bad for you. And I look back and, geez, that was a lot but it went on for more than 10 years. And I still do stories for the Oregonian. And I talk to my husband. I've been a big journaler, so I think that allows me to get my feelings out. And I've just kind of gone through it. My editor did say to me at one point, so I didn't have evaluations for like 8 or 9 years, and then suddenly they start doing evaluations. And so one of my comments on my evaluation was that my editor worried about me because I didn't have somebody in the newsroom to just turn to like you would if you were in a newsroom. That wasn't an option. I worked out of a home office. And so he was concerned that I didn't just, that it was too heavy on me. I wasn't getting it out. And he was also concerned that I was getting too involved in stories. So I was taking it too personally, because I would call him and I would be tearful. And so I just tried to stop showing. If I felt involved in a story, I just kind of tried to shut it down and not let anybody else see it. I don't think that was his intention. I think his intention was just to let me know that his concern, for me.
When I worked at the Oregonian, we had like 4 deadlines a day. And so you'd write the story and then you'd get more information and then you write the story for the next deadline. So you're constantly rewriting that story and it's constantly going through your head. And then sometimes I covered the court trial too. So then you ended up doing that, covering the court trial as well. So it was constantly running through your head. So I've always been curious about how reporters clear that out of their mind. Is there anything that you covered that really that you think about a lot, or that comes back to you once in a while, that either a good story, the fun story that you did, or a more of a traumatic story, something that you haven't quite let go of yet?
Well, fun stories, there weren't a lot of them, but there were some fun stories. One of them was, I would often get called to the aquarium. I lived 6 miles from it. So I'd often get called to the aquarium to cover, either there'd be a new animal coming in, or they'd be doing something that was kind of interesting or new. Like one time they brought in, I think it was 6 7-gill sharks. And so they had to carry them in slings one at a time up the stairs and drop them in the top of the tank. And of course, the aquarium was closed and it was early in the morning, but there were a few people allowed to view it, like family members of the staff, not many. We all had to just sort of stand back and watch. And it was unnerving, because if somebody screwed up, I mean, first of all, you would feel bad for the poor animal, but it's also, the staff. I mean, but they'd get one of them and they'd have it in a sling, and there'd be, I think, 6 people around the sling, and they'd race up the steps and they'd put it in the tank, and then they'd go down and get another one. It went off really without a hitch, but that was kind of nerve-wracking. The other was the Leah kiss, and there was a picture of that in the book where Leah gave me a little smooch. Actually, she gave me a smooch on the lips. And that was when I was there, and she was doing, they were doing painting as enrichment activities with the animals. So that was pretty cool.
For our viewers, tell us who Leah was, or what Leah was.
Leah was a female sea lion. And what they used to do is they would put non-toxic, just this organic paint, I guess, on their flippers. And then they would take a piece of paper up to the flipper and they would sell them in the gift shop. And the animals got a real kick out of it. It kept them, engaged. And then they would give them treats, of course. And in this case, Leah had been through a number of other things, and she kept getting rewarded with herring or whatever they feed them, just dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. And then they said, "Would you like a Leah kiss?" And I said, "Sure." And so they said, "Okay, Leah, give Lori a kiss." And so she leaned in and she just put her little face against mine, or her little lips against mine. And then they have her, hold it for a few seconds. And right at the end, she belched through her nose. And it was like a multitude of fish in my face. It was funny, but it was nasty. It was just really nasty, but it was still, it was still sweet. One story that had been in the book that I took out because I just wasn't sure it had enough heft to it was when the Seattle Seahawks coach came to town, Coach Holmgren, and he was going to do the Blessing the Fleet, and then he was going to come to a seafood feed afterwards. And my husband is a lifelong Seattle fan and just was over the top that he was going to meet the coach. And so we went to the event and waited for the coach, and he didn't come, and he didn't come, and he didn't come, and he didn't come. And the police chief was there, and, the organizers, and we were kind of in a separate area because I was supposedly working on the story. And finally the coach pulls in, and the chief says, "Okay, let's everybody stand back." And the chief and one other person were going to go out and meet him. I'm like, wait, I have to go along. I'm working on a story. Well, the story was already done. But the police chief, who's a great guy, is like, "Well, okay, come on." So my husband and I went out with him, and it was just the 4 of us and Coach Holmgren. And he gets out of his car, and I had on a jersey, a white Seahawks jersey, and my husband had on his Seahawks ring. And you know what? Coach Holmgren was probably one of the kindest people I have ever met. Now, I was in his presence maybe 5 minutes, but I'm not kidding you. He just emanated this goodness. He was so kind and patient, and I just never met anybody like that. And he signed the sleeve of my jersey, and my husband showed him, his or no, he showed my husband his Super Bowl ring, is what it was. And let he put his hand in my husband's and let him admire it. And he said, next time I'm going to bring one home for us, because it was his Super Bowl ring from when he was a coach for, I think, the Packers. He didn't have one for the Seahawks yet. So it was, I'm getting old. These things are getting jumbled.
Well, we have a question from somebody who's watching us. She reading your book, and she cannot say enough about it, how much she's enjoying it. She says it reads like a novel. And then she asks, did you take notes while in the midst of covering a story? And you also mentioned journaling. Do you mind sharing more about that?
So, of course, there were the notes I would take. This was, I still do this, but I'm sure young reporters now probably don't. But I had reporters' notebooks, and hold up my hands. They're about that wide and about that long. Very handy. They just fit right in your hand. And so, of course, when the story's going on, I'm going to tip this in a little bit. When the story is happening, of course, you're scribbling. You're taking note after note after note. You're just going to town. And that's, of course, what you use for your story. And if you're not out on the scene, you're at your computer, then you're taking notes on your computer, by phone, however. And so, but I journal. And so many nights, probably more nights than not, I would sit down at the end of the night and just write about what happened, how I was feeling, maybe how the story happened, how I learned of the story, which is a pretty important part of how things go, because it doesn't really happen necessarily. It's not, sometimes your editor calls and said, hey, I hear this is happening. Sometimes, in case my husband called me one time and said, hey, there are like 3 people drowned in a capsizing. And I said, no, they didn't. I have the press release right here. And the press release led with, 2 people were rescued. And it went on and on and on and on and on for 4 or 5 graphs. And literally the last sentence was 3 people are missing. And it's like, whoa. And I called my editor and she said the same thing. I said, no. She said that. And I'm like, no, read the press release. So how you find out about a story is a completely different animal. But so I would journal about it. I would have my notebooks. And when I decided I was going to write this book, I sat down and I made a list of the stories I felt were the most significant. And then I went through every one of my journals and I went through them and I dated them. They were always dated, but I mean, on the outside of the book, I put the dates, beginning to end, and I numbered it. And I stacked them all up in my office. I think there was 12 or 13. And then I would sit down with the yellow pad and I would list the things in the notebooks that seemed to me relevant and significant. And so between making that list, and then I got all my stories out of the archives, but I also had all my typed notes from the computer, all my computer notes. So I just assembled all of that and then decided how I was going to include it, what I was going to include. But because I had those notebooks, both journals and for work, and the computer notes. So I had all the quotes, whether I used them in the story or not. I had just a wealth of information to rely on. There's one piece of paper I kept. I don't know what made me keep this, but there was a woman who was arrested for something. She's actually a very kind woman, just sort of misdirected. And she called me and I wasn't expecting it and I wasn't on my computer. In fact, I think my computer for some reason was shut down, which will throw you into a panic when somebody calls you with a news story on your computer. So I just grabbed a piece of paper and I wrote what she said because it was really critical. And I have kept that piece of paper along with a couple photos. I walked into the courtroom and she was there. And I said, hey, do you by chance have any photos I could use? And her attorney had left the room and she went to his files, opened up and said, here, do you want this one?
Wow.
It was really a great photo as far as a journalist is concerned.
Wow.
So I've kept a journal since I'm a teenager and it hasn't changed that much over the years. Other than that, what you find significant at 18 and what you find significant at 48 are vastly different. And over the years, you'll read people telling you what you should put in your journal or shouldn't put in your journal, which, at some point you go, oh, okay, I'm doing it wrong, which is all nonsense. You put in your journal what you feel like putting in your journal. And literally at some point in my life where I read that, you should put this in, you should put that in. I said, okay, so I'm supposed to be doing this. And so I wrote fried eggs and toast make me feel like home because, well, fried eggs over and toast do make me feel like home, but who cares? I mean, that's not the most riveting thing in my journals. I got over that pretty right about odd things, just whatever seems relevant to me when I sit down to write. And literally, it can be a cataloging of what we've been doing in the various days. It can be something that has me worried. It can be something I'm celebrating. Um, it can be something that has me puzzled. It can be, I do a lot of fiction and creative nonfiction writing. So I don't use that for revisions or anything else, but I might say that I'm on a creative streak. I might say I'm not getting to my book and I wish I was. I might say that I have gotten to my book. Oddly, I keep a separate notebook. So if something hits me and I go, oh my God, this is what I need to do with chapter 3, that's where I put it. I don't put it in my journal and I'm not sure why. Likewise, I have a notebook on my bedstand, on my nightstand. And if I at 3 a.m. come up with an idea, then I'll just roll over and turn on a little light and I record it there. So yeah, journaling and some form of journaling has been a huge part of my life. And I think it helped me as a writer because I learned when I put pen to the paper, it is as easy for me to express myself as talking, if not easier. And I think that just comes from a long time of doing it, of practice.
Yeah. What did you enjoy most about covering the coast?
The interesting stories that I got to write, the people I met some wonderful people. And it got to the point where I would just be zooming up the coast and I would pull over and take a break with somebody I had met covering another story. And people knew me. I'd walk into a hotel and hello, Mrs. Tobias or Miss Tobias. And so there was that, just logging the roads, knowing that I covered the entire Oregon coast. And as a journalist that I had lucked into a pretty cool beat. Although a lot of people wouldn't see it that way. A lot of people thought I was nuts because I would log. I mean, there was one time there was a situation and I ended up putting in like 760 odd miles over 2.5, 3 days. I got really sick of hotels fast. I used to keep a little bag packed in my car so that if there was like call out I didn't expect, I'd have toothpaste and makeup and a change of clothes and pajamas. But I got to the point I used to love hotels because there's a certain anonymity and freedom about a hotel to me, but I got really tired of it. I got tired of being away. And so I would push myself to just get home, which isn't always wise either, because sometimes you just meant to stay put and take a break.
Being in a newsroom is a lot different than working by yourself. So what kind of skills or discipline did you have to have in order to work independently versus working in a newsroom and having people around you that you could talk to right away and do things with?
Discipline, organization, the ability to just drop everything and go, just change course at the drop of a hat. And yeah, to be okay being alone, to be okay with your own company. It's kind of funny when the New York Times called me to do the story on Christian Longo and his children, the murder of his children, his wife. It was very early on for me coming to the coast. And I had this routine. And part of the routine was the dogs got to take a walk on the beach. And so the New York Times calls me, okay, I'm going to do this story, which of course it was my first for them. So you should be just like beside yourself with glee. I'm like, first I have to take the dogs to the park. This is what we do. And so I took the dogs to the park and I didn't have much time. And I came home and wrote the story. And that was that. But yeah, you have to be able to work alone. You have to be self-motivated. When the stories aren't breaking, you need to go out and find them yourself. You have to be able to, a lot of times I would call the desk to find my editor and ask a question, and they're all doing their own jobs and they really don't want to be interrupted by you, which can be disheartening to say the least. A lot of times I'm sure I was just a pain in the neck to everybody because, but I, if I needed something or I needed to know something or, needed to know where somebody like a photographer was, that was what I had to do. And it was a different time. I mean, it hasn't been that long, but technology and everything else has changed the way we do things.
Oh, I mean, it's just so different. The technology is just so different than it used to be. Speaking of which, a lot of your book is about getting through the layoffs or the buyouts that they did at the Oregonian for several years. And so what would you say is the future of journalism from your perspective?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. It doesn't seem good to me. I feel like the news that really mattered and had any kind of import to it is being overlooked. The Oregonian, I think, is still doing a fine job, but I don't think that many publications are. I think there's so much competing with venues that aren't even news organizations but dominate the airwaves anyway. I don't know. We've lost track somewhere along the line, and I don't know if we'll ever get back on track. And if we don't, I think it's the detriment of society, because I don't think people understand that if you don't have somebody reporting what's going on, you're not going to know. If you don't have somebody doing investigative reporting, we would have never known, for example, about Watergate. We wouldn't know about we wouldn't know about the Holocaust. We wouldn't know about any of those things if somebody out there wasn't filing a news story. We just wouldn't know about it. Yeah. I don't care what anybody says. And the fact that we're losing that, I really, really resented the web involvement in news stories for a while, posting stories. I felt like I was having to post stories before I even had the information I needed. Then there was the old school me who just enjoyed sitting down with a newspaper. That part I got over. And of course, now I love the fact that you can click on and there's the news. I mean, you really can't beat that if it's accurate. And that's the whole thing. Is it accurate? And I didn't like to file a story or post a story when I was still, I had no idea what was really going on other than, the basic facts. But now I guess posting the basic facts is enough until you update it. So there's pros and cons to that.
So we've got a question from one of our viewers about citizen journalists. What do you think about citizen journalists?
In terms of seeing something, like the young woman with George Floyd, kudos to her. I mean, anybody who can stand there when something like that is happening, knowing that the police, as far as I was concerned watching that, were not very trustworthy in themselves. So you're standing there recording what they're doing. I questioned her safety. But so anytime anyone can stop and say this needs to be shared with the world or recorded just because it needs to be recorded, great. I think that's wonderful. And then sharing it with the appropriate people. Then there's times when you can say, well, infringing on people's personal lives, I wouldn't, where's that line drawn? Blogging is fine. Again, as long as it's accurate and you're sure about your information and you're not, infringing on someone's personal space. I think as a journalist with a legitimate outlet, there are rules you follow, there's lines that are drawn, there's things you can do this and you can't do that. And that kind of sets you up it gives you boundaries. And those are pretty necessary and helpful when things are going to hell, to know that I can't do this, or just to know that before I can interview this person, before I can ask them anything, I have to say, I'm Lori Tobias with such and such organization. Just knowing that I have to get that down, because even getting that down, I've walked up to people and started talking, said, I'm Lori Tobias, the Oregonian. We start talking. I'll never forget this. And like 5-10 minutes into this conversation, and he's unloaded everything. And he's like, who are you again? And it's like, dude, I'm with like the biggest daily newspaper in our state. That's who I am. And you just told me all this stuff that could get you in trouble. I don't know that it did. And if it had, I think he would have shared everything he shared with me. He was gonna, to anybody. Yeah. What had happened is they fell asleep on their boat and it had washed ashore. And he was so discombobulated himself. And so he was just gonna tell everybody what was going on. And meanwhile, the thing's leaking oil and nobody's real happy that he's, fouling the water because he fell asleep. So if an attorney had been there, they would have said, shut up.
One other question from a viewer. She says, so many people move to the coast for tranquil setting. Did your beat disillusion you about the coast, about the beauty of the coast?
No, not at all. It made me more aware of my own personal activities. It just made me more aware. It didn't disillusion me. The things that have disillusioned me are more, one of the things that really gets me upset is going to the beach for my morning run or walk and seeing the amount of litter that visitors leave behind. And before anybody jumps down my throat and says, well, how do you know they're visitors? Well, because locals don't usually go out and buy 5-gallon water jugs to carry to the beach, or buy toys for children and leave them on the beach, or buy kites and the wrapping and leave it on the beach. I mean, there's some things, I'm not saying locals never litter, but what you see after a holiday weekend or even after a weekend is just as disheartening as it comes. Having said that, the flip side is there are a lot of people who care deeply about this landscape and will go out there and pick up trash every morning in their walks. Every day they go to the beach. There's a real citizen activism to keep this place clean and to not let the litter and the trash get away. But there's no way. It's disheartening. Traffic issues have become a big problem. Anyway, those are the things that disillusion me.
I find that too. You cover these stories, but I find that I like doing it because it gets me more involved with the coast. You become much more familiar with the coast as more than, of course, obviously a tourist or even somebody who lives here but doesn't get too involved with organizations or people or tragedies or fun stories or whatever. You really get to know it on a personal basis. And for me, that enhanced my enjoyment of the coast. So it didn't disillusion me at all. I know it just made me feel more like I was at home. Yeah.
History here. There's a longevity with families.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. One other question I have is, how important do you think journalism is today?
Oh, as important as ever, as important as it's ever been. I mean, journalism is always important. That people read, or however they get their news, that they get it from a legitimate, trusting, credible source is hugely important. I'm always dismayed and I'm not a news junkie, and I am woefully uninformed about some matters that I shouldn't be. I'll know like the tip of the iceberg, but I don't. I tend to, but knowing what's going on in your own community, in your own state, in your country, is just so important to everyone's lives. And where you get that information it's out there, but the important thing is getting it from credible sources that you really can trust, that aren't just pushing their own agenda or making their advertisers happy. Journalism, I don't know, you want to say, has it ever been as important? But journalism is always important, and I can't imagine that it won't be. I mean, unless somebody comes up with some new way of getting the information out to the world. But to me, that will always be journalism.
A little bit about your novel, Wander.
Wander was my first book, and I wrote that, well, because I wanted to write a novel, but what I put in that novel were all the things, the experiences from Alaska, from when I was a young 20-something from back east who knew nothing about rural living, knew nothing about, and I was actually from a small town. So Anchorage is a city. And back in 1979, when I first went there, it was not a particularly nice city. Anchorage then, and I think even now, strip joints, pawn clubs, escort services. That's just Anchorage. It's gritty. And I don't know how many people know that. It's not, if you go up there as a tourist, do see Anchorage for like 2 hours and then get out of there.
How difficult was it to get your first book published compared to your second book?
Easier. But I had so many rejections with Wander, so many rejections, but they were stupid. Like one agent said, I really like this book, but I can't stand so-and-so. Can you get rid of him? Well, the whole book pivoted around him. So I was like, well, what would I have left if I get rid of this character? I mean, that's the story. So that really made me question agents and their opinions. Stormbeat was easier, but not easy by any stretch. And you always think, oh, I won this award now, everything will be easier. Oh, I got this, everything will be easy. It's not. The publishing world is a tough nut to crack. I don't care what it is. It's really difficult. And sometimes for good reasons, and sometimes, I swear, sometimes it's just the luck of the draw. Sometimes you just happen to contact someone on the wrong day and they're not in a good mood. Or it's not easy. It's really not.
And they're published by two different publishers, right?
Oh, yeah. Red Hen Press is an independent press out of Pasadena, and their whole mission is to promote literature. So I felt very lucky. And my publisher there got me a reading in New York, which was wonderful, unless you have wicked stage fright, in which case it's wonderful after the fact. And OSU, in truth, OSU actually declined Stormbeat about 4 years before they accepted it, which was okay because it needed work. And when you go through a university press, you go through a peer review. And so that means they send out your book, your manuscript, to one or two, or I don't know, maybe more people who are experts or have some credibility in the field as writers and also the topic of your book. And you live or die by what they say. So that can be kind of, in my case, it was wonderful. I had two wonderful peer reviewers. One had absolutely no criticism. Couldn't have been, you live your life waiting for that kind of input. And the other one had a couple things to quibble about, but again, they were just a couple things, and he was like wholeheartedly in favor of publishing it. So it was a good experience. OSU has been fabulous to me, and it's been a wonderful experience.
That's great. Well, our last question is, I'm kind of opening it up to you to say whatever you'd like to say about your book or about covering the coast or what you're doing now.
Well, it's been a lovely experience. People are wonderful, and I've loved publishing both of my books. I'm now working on the revisions of another novel and have another memoir about being married to a lineman that I need to get it written, and it's been like the book I've been planning for 30 years. And I think I'm a little bit afraid of it. So, so I just feel very blessed to have made a life as a writer, and I hope to get to do it for all of my days. And I hope that the people out there who write and get discouraged and see rejection, I hope they keep in mind, just that one word, perseverance. There is nothing else like it.
So Lori, I'm sure glad to be able to meet you. I've heard your name over the years, many times, never got to meet you. And I really enjoyed reading your book. I hope everybody else will enjoy it as well. We do have it available for checkout at the library. And I've really enjoyed our conversation. Well, thank you very much for being with us today. And next book that you write, be sure and let us know so that we can have you on again.
Thank you so much. This was completely my pleasure. I appreciate it, and I hope we get together again.
And thank you for joining us today for Northwest Authors Series, hosted by the Cannon Beach Library. This is our last of our series for this particular year. We will start again in September. So be on the lookout for more announcements about authors coming up for the next year. Thanks again. See you soon.